Hi, Ruha. Welcome to Network Capital. I'm so excited to host you on our masterclass today. You've had a multidimensional, multimodal career spanning various industries. So, could you just give us a flavor of how this journey from being a doctor to a policy person, then going to policy school, and thereafter being an entrepreneur? How did all of this come together? We'll explore in this podcast and podcast. But tell us at a very high level who you are and what do you do?
All right. First of all, thanks, Utkarsh, for having me. Hi, everyone. My name is Ruha, and like Utkarsh mentioned, I won't use the word pivoted. I've moved from being a clinical medicine doctor to working in public health, then eventually coming from my public policy to Harvard, and then starting my own social startup. And if I think what the common thread was for all of this was basically my true north. I've always cared about social impact, and you can see that. So I chose the field of medicine because of the kind of depth of impact that you can have per life. And during medical school, Utkarsh, they actually teach you something called preventive and social medicine. And out of the five and
Mhm.
a half years of MBBS, you're taught this subject for 3.5 years. And I loved preventive and social medicine, also known as community medicine. It teaches you about health systems at a broader level. It almost made me realize that what we do as doctors sometimes is just putting a band-aid, whereas the problem really lies within the larger healthcare system with regards to access to healthcare and social determinants of healthcare, such as education, employment, and income. So being taught that subject for 3.5 years had a huge influence on me, and so did my head of department, or my HOD, sorry. So that pulled me into health systems. That's how I got into public health. And then I eventually came for my public policy master's and not a public health master's because wanted to intentionally take a more interdisciplinary approach on health. And yeah, that's how I landed at Harvard. And my 2 years over there opened up so many windows and opportunities and made me really be able to pinpoint at the cause that I cared most about, which is the problem statement of LedBy Foundation. It's the underrepresentation of Indian Muslim women in the private sector.
Yeah, we're going to unpack this during the course of this discussion. Tell me, in college, you obviously were moved by community health. What did you do right after? And talk to us about your pre-policy school experience.
All right. So I went to Lady Harding Medical College in Delhi. It's a fantastic college. It's over 100 years old. It's all girls. I didn't go to an all girls school, but it was an interesting experience because there was a sense of greater comfort for sure being in an all girls college. And coming to the medical aspect of it, it was an academically very rigorous college, but there were very little avenues to express yourself or to create your holistic personality. And after grinding for years for my pre-medical entrances, when I finally got into medical school, medical college, I really wanted to explore debating, editorial skills, things that I was always interested in, but couldn't take out time because I was studying. So during medical school itself, I started creating communities, organizations, and clubs which didn't exist. So set up the magazine committee, set up the debating society, was also an active part of the students union, trying to create more avenues for young doctors to express themselves. And the thinking behind that was, in this day and age, you can't be hyper focused on your skills or your profession if you really want to create information and disseminate it and be at the 1% of your profession. So even as a doctor, you should be able to have the presence to go and give a presentation on a new research that you've done and be able to share it with the world. So that's where I was coming from in medical school. It was a great
Right.
experience, did well academically, was able to set up a couple of clubs and organizations that run to this date. So they've had like 10 odd editions of the magazine out, I believe. And right after medical school, I was practicing as a junior physician in Delhi itself. And what struck me most was that while working, whether I was working at the government or I was working at a private health clinic that was meant for people with low income, there was a real overrepresentation of Muslims because this was either cheap or free healthcare being provided. And the population that was coming in over here did not have the wherewithal to go to any other place. So these are some of the things that moved me. I the two things I want to highlight over here are quite disparate, but shaped me quite a bit, which is creating organizations or clubs. And something as small as creating a magazine club stayed with me because when we were launching the first magazine, it was basically my idea. And for the forward, what I did with Utkarsh was I probably wrote emails to over 100 eminent persons in India. Nobody replied except one person who replied not even with, hey, can you give me more details? He replied with the written forward, which was clearly specifically written for Lady Harding students. And it was by the former president, APJ Abdul Kalam. So to have him just reply to this cold email gave me so much energy and encouragement that I think it kind of kept me going easily for a decade. And the second thing I wanted to highlight was just the things I saw as a medical student and as a doctor in terms of the population that I was serving, which is again something that I carry with me.
Wow, that's phenomenal getting a reply from the president. That must have been quite an inspiring experience. So you were a practicing physician and you were obviously very interested in social issues, policy issues. What happened after? What made you think through the next steps in your career?
So I was very intentional about practicing medicine for a little bit because I wanted to take my clinical skills and put them in my long-term memory, even though I knew I eventually wanted to get put into more health systems work. So after a couple of years of that, I moved into the public health space, working for an international health NGO called the Clinton Health Access Initiative, where I worked very closely with the government to strengthen and add to existing health systems. So that's how the pivot happened. It wasn't, again, I'm not a big fan of the word pivot, but that's how the transition happened. It was very intentional. And the way you can see my journey is clinical medicine to then public health by working for a large NGO that provides healthcare services and supports healthcare systems. And then I worked for the government, which sets policies essentially. And then while I was at Harvard, I spent my summer interning at the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which is arguably the world's largest donor for healthcare. So all these different aspects for me shaped up in an image of a dining table. So I wanted to see what each seat at this table of public health feels like. So as a provider, I was a doctor, worked for a grantee organization, which is the Clinton Health Access Initiative, worked for the policymaker, which is the government, and then worked for the largest donor. I do think it's possible to have multiple loves in your life and to be able to do justice to all of them. So public health will always hold a very, very big space in my heart. And that's what I spent my time doing prior to Harvard, essentially.
So in a way, it has been a constant, right? Transitioning from public, being a doctor to getting into health systems. How easy or difficult was it to break into, say, Clinton Global Health Initiative and the government thereafter?
Yeah, so thanks for noticing that there is a common thread, and that's why I'm not a big fan of the word pivot. I think if your true north is pulling you, there will be a lot of sense in what might seem like disparate associations or professions. But to answer your question, how did these transitions even happen? I think it happened mostly because I was completely okay with starting from the bottom. Because every time you move to an organization at that level, right after a bachelor's, albeit what I did was a professional degree, you do start from the bottom. And just this absolute zeal to learn. So it was, with regards to the work, not that hard because I just was a sponge and I wanted to take in as much as I could. As for getting in, I did hustle quite hard. With Clinton, I networked, tried to know people, talk to people who worked there, and then get basically an interview and then try to convert the interview to a job. With the government of India, it was kind of tricky because I think 8,000 people applied for these 20 spots that they had for policy professionals to come in. So the getting in requires hustle, requires preparation. But I think what is more important is how you deliver at the job. And you have to have this mentality if you are moving that you're going to have to start from the bottom. But starting from the bottom is incredibly valuable. You learn so much and it comes to support you as you move forward and maybe transition into other things.
Yeah, I can totally, and we love the analogy of being a sponge because you have to absorb and then deliver. So when you think of, say, Clinton Global Health Initiative, what kind of projects you worked with, and what did you learn from them?
So I think I might have been the first or second medical doctor that this health NGO hired. It was full of ex-management consultants. So the great thing over there was I got to learn a lot from my peers, learn Excel modeling and making PowerPoints, which was actually very useful. And I used those skills till date. One project that comes to mind is we were working with the government of Madhya Pradesh and talking about fortified salt being distributed through their PDS or public distribution system shops. Now, these PDS shops would sell highly subsidized salt, which is fortified or enriched with iron, and that would help address anemia. And maternal anemia causes around 30 to 40% of maternal deaths, either directly or indirectly. So there's a very low cost intervention, but a lot of planning had to go around it. You had to understand what is the manufacturing capacity of Madhya Pradesh and neighboring states, what would transportation cost, what would be the cost of enriching it, are there multiple ways of doing it, how do you launch it, which districts or villages or towns do you start with? So I managed to, through a couple of months, put all of this together, worked very closely with the government and the relevant departments. But then I moved on from Clinton to Niti Aayog, to the government of India. And public health initiatives take time. So I was at the beginning of this salt enrichment with iron movement in Madhya Pradesh in terms of actually having it delivered through the government. Having spent maybe 8 months over there working on this project specifically, I then moved on to Niti Aayog. And I remember very distinctly, a couple of months into Niti, I get a call from the Department of Civil and Food Supplies. And they tell me, they say my name and they're like, I don't know if you remember me, but you used to sit in my office every day last summer. And I just wanted to tell you that the program that you created for launching the salt enriched program of Madhya Pradesh has gotten the green light. And that, I think, impacted over 100 million people. Or it was some insane number. But to see a public health intervention from absolute start to actually delivering was so incredibly rewarding. And the numbers were incredibly obscene, the number of people who would be having a more wholesome diet with their iron taken care of, and in turn helping decrease maternal deaths was absolutely thrilling.
One of the benefits of working in such large systemic initiatives is that you just get to understand scale beyond textbook. And that must have been a pretty important learning as you worked in the government. So how does the nature of your job evolve from Clinton Global Health to Niti? And what kind of projects were you enrolled in at Niti? And were there some lessons that you took forward from Clinton Global Health Initiative that were useful for you to do your job better at Niti?
So Niti Aayog was a very interesting experience, mostly because the space that they had created for consultants and young professionals such as me was very new. And with the right kind of mentorship, you were allowed a lot of latitude to do things. And I was fortunate enough to get great mentorship at Niti Aayog, got to dabble in a bunch of projects from the first state health index report to working on setting up the indicators of the aspirational district program. So the 31 health and nutrition indicators was something that I worked on creating. What my takeaway from Niti was, it really helped me understand the pulls and pressures of the government. It is really, really easy to criticize the government when you're outside of it. And as a policy enthusiast, I have done that. But I think I came out more empathetic towards the government after my time at Niti Aayog. The pulls and pressures are very real, and there are a lot of competing interests over there that need to be juggled. As for what I took from Clinton, I think Clinton gave me the opportunity to work with the state government and also see how rollouts happen at the grassroots level. So just having that image while you're sitting at the apex public policy think tank of the government was really useful.
And how did the thought of going to policy school enter? Because you're already in a pretty, I would say, scalable position where you can develop and deliver scalable projects. Why do policy school at all?
So I distinctly remember thinking about policy school back when I was in 11th class. I think I had just discovered who Shashi Tharoor was and learned about his degree called MALT from Fletcher's. And I'm like, that sounds awesome. I want to do that. And when I was reading more about Fletcher's, I learned about the Howard Kennedy School. And I'm like, that program sounds interesting. But my first love was health and medicine. So I continued studying for my pre-med, did all of that. But like I said, your true north just keeps pulling you and will catch up with you, or you will catch up with it eventually. And that's what ended up happening. When I was at Niti, I realized that I was getting a better sense of how things work in the healthcare system. But I did want to, like I mentioned, have a more interdisciplinary lens on things. And I think policies are incredibly powerful tools to bring about change at scale, like you mentioned. And that's how I got pulled into policy and went there for a 2 years master's program.
How did you decide to pick the schools, pick the programs? Because within policy also, there is a wide range of things that one can choose to focus on. What was the process like?